Welcome, fellow business brokers. Thank you for joining Let's Chat, the show where we talk to SBA lenders, attorneys, CPAs, some of the best business brokers from around the world. And my name is Jim Parker. I specialize in selling businesses with gross sales between 1 million and 10 million. I'm really excited because today we have my favorite closing attorney, Deborah Carman. I've been using her a ton over the last couple of years. I really respect her, not just as a closing attorney, but I recommend her to buyers and sellers to help them negotiate LOIs and asset purchase agreements. I'm so excited to have her here today. Deborah, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jim. And it's wonderful to be here today. And it's wonderful to deal with someone in your professional caliber, because then I know that the customers and the clients are going to be taken well care of.
Well, thank you. I just fake it though, Deborah. You make me look good.
That's my job, Jim.
Deborah, today I wanted to talk about, contracts and just go over contracts and discuss contracts with you. And we'll start off easy and we'll just kind of get deeper into things. But, we've got different listeners of all levels. We've got, people that are just beginning as business brokers. We've got intermediates, and then we obviously got the seasoned brokers. So I'm hoping that we're going to give a little bit of information to everybody. And of course, there's sellers and buyers out there that might be listening as well. So I want to give them some ideas of what's going on too. So first of all, when do we use an LOI? When should we go right to an asset purchase agreement?
What I find is when we do some of the larger M&A deals, we do an LOI initially, and then we get to all the points we need for the LOI to start the due diligence, and then we do a definitive purchase agreement. So typically, we are going to do a letter of intent first, and then we're going to later on get into that purchase agreement. It's not the typical LOI that you see in a mainstream deal, because the LOI is going to be a lot more content, have a lot more content to it than the normal LOI for a mainstream deal.
Right.
And those points will be negotiated out. So by the time we get to definitive purchase agreement, we can use that as a roadmap.
Fantastic. And for those of you business brokers that are outside of the state of Florida, I know it's going to seem really odd to you guys, but in the state of Florida, obviously we have the Business Brokers of Florida, and the Business Brokers of Florida has a standard asset purchase agreement that Main Street business brokers use. And it's the most used contract in the state of Florida for buying and selling businesses. Gosh, I can't even imagine. Probably it's used a couple thousand times a year. It's a very fair contract. It looks out for the best interest and the buyer and the seller. Does it weigh one party over the other? It weighs to the buyer a little bit more because they have more to lose. But what it is basically is, it's a fill in the blank contract, kind of like a real estate agent would have with a FAR bar contract. So from the Main Street businesses, that's what we use. And I know that there's other states around the country too, and other brokers that I've talked to around the country that will just go to an APA when they're doing a smaller transaction. And that's what I do. And then, like Deborah, like you said, the bigger the transaction, we start getting into the LOIs. And
right. And as you mentioned, for Main Street, that contract is perfect. When you start getting into these other ones, then everyone seems to have their own contract that they wish to use. And for the majority of the time, it's going to be the buyer who's going to provide the contract to me if I represent the seller. And usually these companies are looking to pick up maybe 10, 12, 15 other companies in the same situation, same business. So it's always a standard contract they start out with.
Great. And then, I use the LOI sometimes on smaller deals too. If it's got if there's some complications in the business, there's a lot of moving parts in the business too, is when I use the LOI.
No, that's a good point. And then if it is a Main Street deal, what happens is many times people don't want to get the contract because they want to look at the books.
Right.
And you get to the point where it doesn't even make sense anymore without them taking a look, or they're concerned about, a high concentration, let's say with one particular client. What I'm doing right now, I just found out that they have a 20% concentration for one particular customer, and that becomes an issue. So they want to take a look at all the rest of the books and decide what they're doing before they get into a purchase agreement.
Okay. So what kind of things do you do from an attorney perspective when you're dealing with a situation with high client concentration? What are some tips you can give brokers?
Well, in a high client concentration, sometimes if we have a promissory note, what we'll do is then instead of, we can do a dollar for dollar reduction over here if these clients leave within a period of time. We can do something along the lines even with the note being forgiven, just many different ways to go ahead and look at this. And one of the big issues here, though, is when you deal with an SBA lender, you just have to be careful there too, because they don't like to have high concentrations.
Yes, they don't. I'm actually working on a listing right now where there is high client concentration. There's a client concentration of 24% for the top
Yeah.
client, 18% for the second client. And we're not taking
Hmm.
to the market yet. We're strategizing how to overcome that obstacle and another obstacle. But what I'm doing, the approach that I'm taking as a broker is that I've given them the broker's opinion of value, and I
Hmm.
told them that they should have a forgivable seller's note on a
Right.
portion of that. And I think I did it
Right.
at 25%. And so if the
Hmm.
seller, the buyer takes over and the buyer loses one of those clients dollar for dollar, they would be reduced from the seller's forgivable note. And the good thing for you guys, business brokers out there, is that this business should qualify for an SBA loan. I'm actually getting it pre-qualified right now for an SBA loan. And you can do forgivable seller notes with SBA loans. It's been
Right.
happening for years, but SBA came out this year and they actually gave it their blessing. So we're in good shape with that.
No, and that makes it a lot nicer, Jim. It really does. And you just like I mentioned before, you have to also sometimes put in there an escrow holdback if you're not going to have a note and work it that way. And you also want to make sure your transition is very good with the seller staying on for a period of time and actually introducing you to those key clients because that's the
Right.
biggest problem you can have. And then sometimes they want to say that the business has been sold, and sometimes they want to say they brought in a financial partner
Yeah. And
because
so
again,
do you hold monies back even if you have a forgivable seller's note? Or if you're doing a seller's forgivable
no,
note, you're
no,
not
I don't
holding
have
monies
a
back.
seller's note. Well, let me put it this way. Forgivable seller's note, I'm not going to use an escrow holdback, but sometimes I will use a note and an escrow holdback if I have a 10-year standby.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No one don't want to do that 10-year standby.
Right. 10-year
Don't want to do that
standby is
from.
not going to help you if there's a
Yeah.
situation for
Yeah.
right now. So, and that's a good point. We always look to see what we need to do with an escrow holdback for transition many times as well. Because remember, you have a buyer that doesn't have any idea what the seller really does on a day-to-day basis, hasn't really met with the clients, and they're winding up taking over a business. If that seller leaves, they have a real issue. And it's hard to quantitate that too, Jim, because seller walks away and this business is really dependent upon seller introducing them and seller being there. What do you really have?
Right, exactly. And that's why you gotta figure out a solution for the buyer to overcome that. And really, to me, it should be figured out before you go to market. It's not, I don't think, like, I don't want to take an obstacle and leave that obstacle out there and then try to deal with it with buyers down the road, because a lot of buyers just walk away. Dealing with it up front and saying, hey, they're willing to do this, they're
Mhm.
willing to do that, then it puts you in a better situation to keep buyers interested in it. Like, another thing I'm doing on that, and I don't want to go down this road too much, but
Yeah.
another thing is I've asked this the well, that wasn't client concentration, that was something else, so I apologize.
No,
What
no, no,
other
but
key?
everything you're saying makes a lot of sense, and that's why you're as good as you are. A lot of times, though, it hasn't happened that way. It'll come to me, and then I've got to figure out the solution. And that's one of the things we look to do.
Yeah, got you. So,
So,
what are some key components that should be in an LOI?
in an LOI, you should have the key components besides the purchase price would be if you have a targeted working capital that you're looking for, should be reps and warranties that are usual and customary. Non-compete terms are going to be in there. And you want to make sure as well, if there's particular key employees that you're trying to get a handle on, maybe they need to be mentioned there. There's a lot of different issues. It's really difficult to say every single one of these
Right,
components is
right.
going to be in there, but you want to make sure it's as thorough as you can, not to make it into its own definitive purchase agreement, but you want to
Mhm.
flesh out enough that those concerns they're addressed, like you said, right in the LOI.
Right. My approach to the LOI is that if we're going to do an asset purchase agreement, say it's a million and a half dollar deal, enterprise value, and things are pretty straightforward. Let's say it's a landscape
Hmm.
business, for instance, and things are pretty straightforward. Go right to APA. If it's more of a complicated situation, we got construction maybe construction
Mhm.
company and you got a lot of different moving parts because that can get complicated very quickly. That's when I do an LOI or go to, advise to do an LOI. I personally do not draw up LOIs. I don't have
Right.
a problem doing a fill in the blank asset purchase agreement, but I do know that other brokers they do the LOIs, and my fear is like 2 or 3 word change can make a big difference. What do you think?
And
I
if
mean,
I
I would
could address
imagine.
that too. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
please.
one
I
of the
want you to.
problems is state of Florida is very, you have a real estate license here from the state of Florida. You're under FREC, and very different over here from a lot of other states. But also, every state has something where you cannot practice law, and that's why
Mhm.
state of Florida has said we have fill in the blank contracts, we have fill in the blank LOIs, put the purchase price, put the non-compete, put the same terms in over there. But as you start writing something, remember you are practicing law,
Yep.
which is actually a felony in the state of Florida. So nobody wants to ever wind up practicing law for a client. What you want to do is associate then with an attorney, whether it's buyer's attorney, seller's attorney, puts it together, and they do that. And
Yeah.
that way you're kept out of doing anything where there's, number one, an issue for you, and number two, you basically can go ahead and talk back and forth to all the clients where it winds up where we could become quote unquote the bad guys.
You know how I operate because we do a lot of deals together. I get an LOI from a buyer, and it's my listing. I tell the seller,
Hmm.
don't even sign the LOI. You need to go speak to Deborah, or you need to go speak to an attorney that specializes in the sale of businesses, not your typical business attorney. Somebody like Deborah. I won't even have them. I always advise them when they get an LOI to go to an attorney. And I know some brokers
No,
just
that's
like go ahead and
great
sign, but
advice.
I'm sorry.
Great advice, Jim. And let's say that you get to a point, and you're going through some of the terms of the LOI. You shouldn't really, you can explain them obviously in your sense as a business broker, but they're going to have legal ramifications. Let's go one
Yep.
step further and you want an NDA. I have a lot of companies in these M&A deals where they acquire, let's say it's pool companies, let's say it's auto shops, whatever they're going to acquire, they acquire them and they're in competitive businesses. So
Hmm.
you might want to be very careful when you do this LOI. You have an NDA that's standard, but you want to make sure sometimes some other terms in over there about whether they're going to compete, whatever they're going to do is in the LOI itself. And remember,
Right.
when you deal with an LOI for a buyer, the buyer's biggest problem is they don't care so much that this doesn't stay alive if there becomes an issue and they don't want to continue to buy. But you want to make sure as well for that particular buyer, there's a provision where they're not going to sell to someone else. So you're going to have that no shop clause or
Right.
exclusivity clause. So everybody has a different aim for what they're looking at for in this LOI. And
All right.
remember, when you start dealing with M&A deals, there's not even deposits placed in line. Makes a lot
Right.
of
Yeah.
people nervous if they're not used to it. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a big change for Main Street business brokers, and when I started doing bigger deals, something that I was taken back to too as well without the deposits and this, and then you have to explain to the sellers as well, that
Right.
no, there's no deposit being put up. Deborah, do you mind sharing for those that don't know why on the bigger deals there's no deposit put up?
On the bigger deals, what they're looking at is that they're taking their time and their interest and their monies to investigate your business, go through your QuickBooks or whatever else you have, do their own investigation, and they don't care about putting money up in that respect. So you have to kind of look at their buyer and say, is your buyer legitimate, which is what you're doing when you look
Hmm.
at that buyer, or is that buyer out in left field? I have had some buyers out in left field. And at some points, then we're like, we request that they have a deposit because they haven't bought other businesses before. They don't really have any kind of a record in doing anything. And what they're looking to do sometimes is borrow money from 5 or 6 other people and come in to take over this business. So when you're doing that, you're a little more suspect. But if you see a company out there that has a reputation for acquiring other businesses, they've been doing it on a regular basis, they have a whole attorneys team, which we start working with, then you realize at that point you don't need an escrow deposit.
Right. And,
And
and
I talk to my sellers, explain to them this is the process. And truthfully, if you do even a Main Street deal, and I know if they're going to walk away down the road, okay, they're going to walk away during due diligence
Yeah, and they're going to get their deposit back anyways.
and they get their deposit back. Correct.
My biggest thing for deposit as a business broker on the smaller transactions is because you want to see the seriousness of the buyer, that they're not just
Yeah.
signing the document, but they're putting deposit up and how serious they are. When it comes to the bigger
No, it's very different.
transactions, I'm sorry, Deborah?
It's very
Yeah.
different, Jim. You're right.
Yeah. And then the bigger transactions, the buyers they are typically going to be spending a lot of money to go down the process. So that is showing you that they're serious, that they're doing that. They're going to have a due diligence team, or maybe they're doing a Q of E
Yes.
or whatever it is. They're spending a lot of money on it. Not they're showing their seriousness that way. So it really,
Correct.
the deposit doesn't matter. Like you said, Deb, but they get it back anyways. If
They
they
get
break
it
during
back.
due
And
diligence.
I can't tell you, even in Main Street deals, how many times we have escrow disputes.
Yeah, I hate
So,
escrow disputes.
in a large, you don't want to necessarily have that hanging over you either. You want to actually, and I know you do a fantastic job in qualifying the buyers, and that's really what you're doing there is you're taking your expertise and saying this buyer has the wherewithal to come in and take care of what they need to do. And let's say they even have a Main Street deal and it winds up being SBA, whatever. We can get an idea from, really what they're doing there and what the approval process is going to be, how far they're along in that process, etc. So they started out with an LOI, now they're doing a purchase agreement. We know that they've got a commitment letter coming,
And
and that
how
gives you a little more.
comfortable feeling.
Yeah, yeah,
What is kind of, and I know it from a broker standpoint, but I'd love to hear your input. Going from an LOI, so that you do the LOI, and you know what? I had an attorney one time. Getting off subject real quick, I had an attorney one time that we did an LOI, and then they immediately wanted to go to contract and then do due
yeah.
diligence after the contract. And to me, that seemed backwards. And I was trying to tell the attorney, I don't want to do that way because I don't want my buyer and seller to be spending their money on legal fees until they get done with the due diligence. I kind of look at the LOI as here's the outline of what the contract's basically going to look like. And you guys are going to build upon that, but then let's do the due diligence. And then when we get towards the end of due diligence and it looks like it's going to go through, then let's get the attorneys back engaged to actually draw up the contract. And that's how you like to work as well, right?
I do, except for a lot of these people are extremely serious. And if
Mm-hmm.
they're serious, they already have the contract almost written by the time that we're done over here with the LOI. They provide it to us. We get going on it. And then by the time that we have a contract in place, we're ready to close.
Mm.
So it's a
Okay. So
very
maybe I'm doing it
different.
backwards, Deborah. Am I doing it backwards?
Well,
Honestly?
you have to really know who your buyer is. If you know your
Right.
buyer is extremely serious, they've gone through this, they really feel comfortable with the numbers. Now it gets to the point where they want to get legal involved and they want to make sure that everything is done properly. Remember, there's a huge difference between an M&A contract and a Main Street as far as how this is closed. When I take a Main Street deal, I am going to write up my own documents at the end of that contract for closing. When you
Mm-hmm.
do usually these M&A deals, everything is part of the contract. So your non-compete's already part of the contract, your promissory note, your bill of sale, everything is already there, and you're not adding additional closing docs, save for, let's say, resolutions
Right.
for the corporation.
Yep. Yep.
Okay. And
Yep.
that's it. But everything is done as one package deal. Okay. And it's always, I love this part of it. At the end, we do the little Zoom call. Everybody says it okay to release this page, it's okay to do this. We collect the signature pages, and closing is more or less congratulations, congratulations, congratulations.
Right. Right.
Totally
Right.
different way of doing it.
Different
And the
world. Yeah,
reason,
it is.
different world. And the reason for that is um, you don't necessarily want to take away or add more with your closing documents to what a contract is. But when I take a contract already pre-printed, I have to follow that contract, and but it's always potentially going to make a change.
Mm-hmm.
So when you
Yeah.
have everything done in an M&A deal, it's all one big package.
Right.
But
Right. Right.
sometimes
Yeah.
I have one right now, and it happens to be with a lender. So the lender says, I need everything now. I need that contract signed now. So I can't piecemeal it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then get one big package at the end and sign everything. I got to have things signed along. So
Right.
everything changes. So you can't say everything is one way.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And we've done a lot of deals that way, Deborah. Because with the APA, like when I give you the APA, the BBF
Right.
APA, and then you prepare for the closing. You're taking basically the BBF APA and you're using that as a guideline and you're expanding. So you're taking that two small paragraphs on a non-disclosure and it's turning into maybe a page and a half or 2 pages, and you're doing that with basically every section. But
Correct.
then on the bigger deals that we do together, you're right. We do the LOI, and then it basically the from there the contract is the closing documents as well. It's all one piece. But
Exactly. Exactly.
hmm,
So there is no room for interpretation on the closing documents. It's all part of the contract.
right, right. Yeah, so that's so. I just want to ask this again because that's how I've always worked, Deborah, and I want you to be honest with me. If I
Mhm.
am dealing with a situation with an LOI, and everybody executes that LOI, I at that point say, okay, let's begin due diligence, and let's say the due
Right.
diligence is to say 30 days. Maybe 3 weeks in, it's like, okay, buyer, how is things looking? Blah 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 blah. They're like, yeah, everything's looking great. We just got a few more
Hmm.
things we need to finish up. Okay, great. Let's get the docs start drafted, and that's when I go into the legal. But you're saying that sometimes or a lot of times that they're right after the LOI, they're starting to put the contract together.
Yes. Yeah.
Wow.
And you have to feel who the buyer is. I mean, sometimes, because remember, a lot of these contracts are going to have negotiated terms in them, but they're going
Hmm.
to be contracts they've used in previous deals. So they're not
Yeah.
reinventing the wheel and writing a new contract. They're just
Yeah.
adding the terms of this particular contract into what they have. They're going to provide that to me pretty quickly. And I don't hold off normally because it makes sense to get this ready for closing because they're serious buyers. They've gone through enough due diligence to know what they want. Now,
Yeah.
and it was interesting. I did a very, very large deal for a food company last year, and they had everything done within 60 days,
Hmm.
and it was a very, very, very large deal. But
And they
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 knew
closed it and
everything they
everything.
needed. They closed it within 60 days. It was perfect,
Oh, that's
absolutely
fantastic.
perfect. Yeah, and some I can do within 30. It just depends upon what goes on now. I'm doing
What?
another one right now. And again, there's 30 days because SBA wants to close it. And of course, everybody's worried. Let's see, it's 9/8. Everybody's worried that 10/1 we're going to have a problem where the government's going to do a shutdown.
Yeah.
So everybody's like, I need to do this by the end of the month. Okay, fine.
Do you see many? What are the main problems that you see going from an LOI to the purchase contract that people
Well,
dispute over?
expand the representations and warranties. And
Yeah.
also remember when I try to do in these LOIs, I try to say how much will be capped at because what we do when we do the M&A deals, we usually provide a cap over here for non-fundamental reps. Okay, fundamental reps are, for instance, do you have authority to act on behalf? Do you own the assets, etc. Okay, and even the brokers or their fees, and you have a broker and you're going to pay them. That's in the fundamental representations in the contract. But when you start dealing with non-fundamental representations, you start dealing with a cap on how much liability you're going to have. And the
Can you
cap
give
could be
some
anywhere from
examples of
20
some
to 50%.
non-fundamental? Can you give some examples of some non-fundamental
Yeah, for instance,
reps?
non-fundamental, you would say things like how many vehicles you have, what condition they're in, things like that. You're making representations as to employees,
Your
as
financials.
to your financials, environmentals, even all that can become non-fundamental representations. And remember, representation is different from a warranty because a representation is a statement of fact, where a warranty is a promise. It's an obligation. So as many warranties, yeah, I'm going to warrant that this is here. Warrant. That's why you see a lot of times it says to the best of seller's knowledge or the seller's knowledge. Every time you use these qualifiers, though, you weaken the actual warranty or representation that's made. So then
Right.
you have to
Okay.
look at that and say what is reasonable there and what is not. Some attorneys sit there and just say, "Oh, everything's to the best of the client's not." That's not good enough.
Right.
Okay, because you should know.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
either breaking the law or you're not breaking the law. You either have what you need for permits and licenses, or you don't.
So let's talk about caps real quick.
So
So let's say we got a transaction going on, and let's say it's 5 million, and there's a
mhm,
you're going to put a cap on that on the reps and warranties,
right
so that the seller
on the
is not going to be
indemnification,
obligated for the whole 5 million or more post closing. You're trying to
right.
protect that. and you're
Right.
capping and
Right.
saying, hey, it can't be more than whatever it is, X amount of dollars.
Yeah, so let's say
Um,
it's $1 million and we get it for 1 million or 1,500,000, whatever else it is, period. That's the most that anybody could go back for those particular representations and warranties that they sue the seller. Now, remember, if the seller commits fraud or cooks the books, then all this is going away because the caps will mean nothing.
yeah. Okay. Great. And then not only have a cap, but sometimes you can have a basket, right? And if you can explain what a
Oh, yeah.
basket
Yeah.
is.
So a basket is people in the larger deals don't want to be bothered if I messed up and didn't give you scotch tape. Okay. You want to make sure it's something substantial. It's not somebody, not you didn't pay your FPL bill for $200, whatever it's going to be, period. They want to make sure it's a substantial amount before you're going to come back to them. So baskets are anywhere from 5,000 to 20,000 to 50,000, just depending upon what it is. So sometimes you'll use a basket instead of using a cap sometimes because if you have to reach $100,000 to get $1 back, people usually don't get there. It would have to be
Hmm.
something pretty egregious to get to there. So the higher that basket is, the less likely they're going to reach it.
So basically, and let me see if this is a good way to explain it. So a basket, you think of an
Yeah,
actual basket, like, a basket,
right,
and you've got your low end and you've got your low end, like, okay, you're not going to come back to us on anything less than $20,000,
right.
and on the high end, you're saying, the most that we're gonna rep and warrant is $1 million. So, and that's
Yeah.
probably a huge thing. But anyways, in this example, so
Mhm.
20 grand to 1 million, that's your basket. And if something falls in with that range, it's taken care of. Is that a good way of explaining it in simple terms?
Well, it explains the
Or
basket part of it, but it's not capping. When you cap the liability, what you're doing is you're providing a cap over there for, we're never going to be able to get more than this amount of money out of you. For a basket, it's how much for instance, let's say that something came back where you didn't pay a vendor, okay,
mhm.
or a third party claim or anything like that, or there's no insurance involved. There should have been insurance. There wasn't insurance. Now you're reliable for it. It's for when you operated your business prior to closing, and it's your responsibility. Let's use that as an example. So that third party claim is there, and that third party claim up to 1.5 million or $1 million, whatever you capped it at, would have to be taken care of.
Okay. All right, good.
Okay. But you might have a situation where a bill was left out or someone didn't get paid. So at that point, you're going to have a basket and you would bring to them, listen, I have a situation over here, a $5,000 basket. I have a $10,000 liability. So what'll happen is once you get past that 5,000, it'll go back to $1.
Okay.
And you can
Okay.
accumulate them as well. It doesn't have to be just one. So if you got 5 or 6 different things, the landlord came back to you for something that happened prior. They made a CAM adjustment, something even as simple as that. So now you're having to get that taken care of. When I have buyers on the other hand say to me, "Well, why do I have to wait for that? It's $1,000. Why should I even have to wait for 5,000 before I do this? It doesn't seem right. I should eat $1,000." So you have to balance everything. Everything in this whole situation is a balance.
Yeah. To me, it's just you
And
don't
the
want to
larger
end up
you get,
nickeling it. But you're doing a $5 or $10 million deal, enterprise value deal. You don't want to be dinkering over $1,000, and wasting everybody's time. That's
no,
how
it
I
costs
look
more
at
to
it.
get the lawyer involved if yeah,
Right.
exactly,
And I
exactly.
think
But
that's where
what's
that.
happening, and let me tell you where some of the frustration comes in, Jim. Sometimes you'll take a smaller size business and it'll be picked up by someone who's doing M&A transactions. Okay, it could be even less than 1 million, but they're still
Mhm.
going to give you the same contract, same concerns, same items over here as if you had a $5 or $10 million business or a $50 million business.
Yeah.
So that's where it gets frustrated to someone. I don't want to do 5,000. I want to do. I want $1,000. Over here, if in that sense, and you're going to do more if it's a seller because sellers like, I'm already getting less money in the sense of for this crazy contract for how long it is. I prefer then that you have to wait and get 10, 15, 20,000 before you bother me.
Yeah. Sometimes because I deal in the 1 million to 10 million gross sales, so I kind of get, and I do
Yeah.
deals that are smaller than that. Maybe some deals that are bigger than that, but like that's my world, and so I've kind of got my feet in both worlds. Like I don't consider myself an M&A guy. I don't consider myself a Main Street guy. I kind of consider myself an upper Main Street. individual. And if I think it's
Right.
more going to be an M&A type deal, and that's a whole webinar on its own. But to me,
Hmm.
I don't put it to a dollar amount. I put it to who the most likely buyer is going to be. That's how I
Correct.
determine where it is. And if I think it's going to be a true M&A type deal where we're talking about private
Yeah.
equity groups, I refer that on. But I live in both of those worlds, and because of that, Deborah, you were talking about the individuals coming from the M&A world. That happens to
Right.
me quite a bit. I'll get somebody that is a buyer that has worked at a private equity group or is somehow got experience in the M&A world, 50, with a company that we're buying businesses for 50 million, 100 million, things like that. And they're coming down and looking at a business that I have for a million or 1.5 million, and they're trying to make it an M&A deal. And I'm trying to
Right.
explain to them, you know, it's really great you have that experience, and that's fantastic, and it's going to be easier for us
Right.
moving forward. But the one thing you need to learn right now is you're stepping outside of your world and you're coming into my world, and there's
Right.
differences in our worlds, EBITDA, discretionary earnings, how contracts are done,
Yeah.
LOIs. It's night and day. Not night and day,
Well, you're
but
bringing
it's
up a story from one of the clients I had years ago. I represented the seller, and the buyer came in out of getting an MBA. And I
hmm,
can always tell, whether it's a buyer that's been sophisticated in doing this or whether they've actually pulled something from the internet
textbook. Yeah.
textbook. Okay. And I'm like, this is not textbook. Let's talk about what you want to do. And it's always interesting because I'll see someone, because, a lot of the people coming out of school now, very bright. Okay. But they approach these deals right out of a textbook. So we
hmm
try to work with them. We try to work with all different kinds of people to get everybody where they need to be.
Right.
But it was just, I just had to laugh for a minute because I remember that one particular person out of Wharton, and he had this beautiful LOI right out of a textbook. Nobody would sign it. So,
That's what
and
everybody's
that's
got to
another
keep.
thing.
What's
Yeah.
that?
No, it's another thing, when we start thinking about too, I always see targeted working capital, and then of course you find what the actual working capital is going to be. Because remember, people need to operate their business and they need to have money to operate the business. So you're going to see that in these M&A deals too.
Right, right, right. We're Main Street. You're not dealing with working capital. The buyers usually getting the working capital, themselves
Right.
or from the SBA on the larger deals. That's included. You're talking about working capital, AR, cash, things like that. So yeah,
Exactly. Exactly. And it's, what kind of business is it? I mean, do you need a qualifier? Are they coming in and qualifying it, themselves? What kind of experience do they have with this particular industry? So, are they going to leave the people in place? A lot of times, what happens in these M&A deals is they are interested in leaving the seller there. The seller is going to continue operating that business for them.
right. Yep,
I've
yep.
had landscaping companies that way. I've had companies involving, even nurseries, whatever, because the expertise and the people that they know comes with the seller. Seller remain on there as an employee for a while.
Right. Yeah. When Main Street, they're always going, and also when you get into the M&A, they're also asking a lot. The buyers are always asking, is there somebody else that can step up and take that role? Because in a Main
Right.
Street deal, even Upper Main Street, the buyers coming along. They're going to buy the business and they're going to be an owner operator. In M&A deals, it's usually some kind of investment team that's coming in, and they're going to be hiring somebody to actually do the
Right.
day to day
Right.
operations. So.
Right, but that's another part of the the LOI you have to be careful with because you have to be explicit. What do they want you to do if you're staying on as a seller? What are they going to pay you? What are your terms going to be? What's your comp package going to look like, etc. Because a lot of times it makes it more enticing for someone to stay on in the business. And
Deborah,
I think you and I, yeah.
go
Go
ahead,
ahead, Jim.
Deborah. I'm so sorry. Go ahead.
No, no, no. I was going to say, and sometimes in these larger deals too, we have something where they have rollover equity. They have these other companies they want them to invest in, take some of that money, and we work that out in a lot of different ways too. Because what happens with these larger companies is they're going to do an escrow holdback. So
Mhm.
sometimes I take the escrow holdback and I'll say, gee, instead of being in this situation over here, can we take that and do rollover into your other company?
Right. And I want to get to that in a minute. I want to get to rollover equity in a minute. I do want to say that the brokers that are listening, the world, like I said, the world I work in is like a step in both the M&A, the lower M&A and upper Main. And, but and I know my audience out there, the people that tend to listen to these podcasts are Main Street business brokers. But
Hmm.
this is a really good information. And Deborah, I kind of want to keep staying on this path because this is what, you're a regular Main Street business broker out there, and then you get a deal that maybe is selling for 4, 5, 6, $10 million. And now
Right.
you're entering that world of lower middle market, and you need to know these terms. You need to know how they're structured and the thought processes and things like that. So I wanted to say this, but let's go over to rollover equity. You and I recently did a
Yeah.
rollover
Yeah.
equity situation.
Right.
The seller was selling. I don't want to say what type of business is. I want to keep it confidential. You know which one I'm
Right.
talking about, though, Deborah?
Yep. Yep.
Okay, so yeah, the seller was selling the business, and the buyers came along, and they had just acquired another similar type business, and they want to do a roll up. Roll up meaning they want to buy a bunch of these type of businesses all down the east and southeastern United States and roll them up into one company. And they approached my buyer, or my seller, with the aspect of, hey, do you want to invest in the bigger picture of things? And
Right.
so that's what we ended up doing, was a rollover equity situation. Deborah, can you elaborate on rollover equities
Yeah,
and how that
rollover
works?
equity, what you're doing is you are taking a portion of your purchase price and putting it into that new company. So whether it's you did a $5 million deal and now you're going to go ahead and take 1 million of that 5 million and invest it into that other company that owns maybe three or four other companies right now, and take the opportunity to say, I'm going to make money back on my investment. Plus, it shows solidarity with your buyer because your buyer says, you believe in me.
Yep.
And the
Yep.
buyer also looks at it and says, seller, I believe in seller because seller's willing to take the risk with me.
Yep.
So
And
it's a whole different mixed bag. You have to look at it very carefully because you have to be able to risk that money.
yep, you do. And you because they may not ever see that money because they're basically investing in that larger corporation or larger company. That
Exactly.
if things don't go well, then things are not going to go well. I'll tell you why my seller decided to move forward, was because he looked at the buyers. The buyers were really smart individuals, and they had already acquired one company. And we sat down and had a couple-hour conversation with the buyers. My seller really believed in them, and
Hmm.
we talked about it. And I was talking to my seller. I'm like, hey, at the end of the day, that money, you may never see that money, but if the feeling you're
Right.
telling me about these buyers, you seem like very confident in them, so you're going to get a second bite of that apple down the road, and it
Right.
could end up being
Right.
more than what you got the first time. So
Exactly. Exactly. And so you kind of have to weigh that out. And in your case, for that scenario, it was a great match and it was a great ability for him to earn more money. Some of these you have to look at and you just have to be a little more suspect of
yep,
really what they're going to do. And, because remember, you're a minority member. So they're really going to do whatever they want to do in that LLC, and you're not going to have much say.
yep,
So you have to look at it, evaluate it, just as if you're doing any other investment and see what you want to do there. But like I mentioned, sometimes we use that as a different kind of escrow holdback.
yeah,
So yes, we put our money with you, and if there's a problem, then you can take it out of that money we gave you. We're not taking two bites of that apple and giving you some money there and also doing a huge escrow holdback
yeah.
because these
You know,
buyers also want to see, that you've got something here at stake. So when you sell them the business, you don't leave.
yeah. Deborah, you
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 give
made
them
a
a
good
transition.
you made a good point on you made a bunch of good points in that, and I totally agree with you that it is showing proof that the seller feels confident the business is going to do well, and has confident the buyer is going to do well with it as well. But you made the comment
Hmm.
as well about they're going to be a minority shareholder. And
Right.
so, like, when I'm in a situation with like a rollover equity situation, and the one we just did, that was a perfect example. Is I had a heart to heart with the seller, because you're in a
Right.
situation where the business owner has been their own boss for 25, 30 years. They're making
Right.
all the decisions at the end of the day. They have all the control, and it's really hard to take that type of an individual and throw them into a situation where they basically have no control. I mean, they have some input, but at the end of the day, they're not making the decisions. And that's a big thing for a seller to not be able to get over. And you have to have, I think
It,
that's part of our job as brokers, is to have those heart to heart conversations
right, right.
with our sellers and buyers about things like that.
No, I agree with you, Jim, and I know you do an excellent job at doing that. And I always get a better feeling when I talk to the sellers about it afterwards because they have been informed. And that's one of the things that we look to do as their attorney as well, is make sure they know what they're doing and make sure they know what to expect. I had a deal, and it wound up that the seller stayed on, and the seller could not get along with the buyers. Didn't matter what
Mm,
it was. It was I went ahead and negotiated this great comp package, and I'm getting a call every single day. I can't stand it here. I don't want to be here. What do I do? So you have to think about all aspects of it, and you almost have to give them a kick out clause if they want it, so they're not in breach. So you have
right.
to look at it in all different ways over here because, it's like a marriage. Everyone thinks it's going to work out. It's going to be great. It's going to be the best thing since sliced bread. And then you wind up and they're actually together, and everything the buyer said about how he's going to run the company, he didn't do.
Yep.
Because
Yep.
remember, what's the seller's biggest fear? I built my baby. Now you call my baby ugly, and now you don't want to go ahead and do what you need to do to keep my baby going. You want to change my baby, okay? And
Hmm.
now my baby is ugly, okay? So you have to just weigh everything out with that seller and figure out what you can do, and not necessarily pigeonhole them.
And it's not just pigeonholing the seller, but you got to think about from the buyer's perspective too. Like they may look at
Oh,
the
right.
seller
Yeah.
post closing and be like, "Wow, we got to get this guy out the door." I mean, like, but
Right.
we're
Right. It's
obligated to pay him
poison.
the
It's a
X
poison
amount
for
of
the
dollars
husband.
salary. What's that?
It's funny. You make me think of another story I had where they loved the husband and hated the wife.
Oh, oh,
Okay, and the wife was in the company with him, and I remember I get all these calls because I represented the buyer, and the buyer would be like, "I got to get this wife out of the office. Help me figure out how to get her out of here because she's poisoning all my employees against me."
oh, jeez.
So there's all, it's interesting because it doesn't even matter if it's a small deal, large deal, whatever. Everything is based on human emotions.
And personalities.
So you almost personalities, and you got to figure out how are they going to fit together, what are they going to do, and even if it is a very large situation, you keep them there for 6 months. Sometimes the next 6 months we put as an option.
Mm, mm.
Everybody's
You know,
happy, everybody wants to do it, we can do it there, but they've got 6 months transition promised.
I think that's a good middle ground there, that both parties can get out, because it could go either way. Either way, they could not like
Right,
the
right,
situation. So
right.
that's a good way. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So we were talking about rollover equity and things like that. What about other terms that brokers might hear, like tag along, drag along calls, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, when you have a tag along over here, you're going to see this in these LLCs for these rollover equities, where all members have the right to sell units, and the other people then have the right to buy them. When you start doing drag along, just like it says, we're selling over here at this amount of money, and we're dragging you along over here, and you're going to sell with us.
Yeah.
So a lot of times these are negotiated out because people say, well, I need at least a minimum. I need something over here, depending on the size of the deal. If it's
Can you
rollover equity, you're not going to really be able to do that. Rollover equity usually has other members at that point, and you're not going to be able to negotiate as much as you'd like to.
Right, right. So you kind of flew through the tag along and drag along. Can you give a better
Yeah,
definition of what each one of those terms means for our audience, and a
sure,
scenario,
sure.
and like a scenario or an example?
Right. So what you're doing is you're going to sell a certain amount of units. Okay. So you have these minority members. And what you're saying to the minority members is, we're going to have units for sale over here. They're going to have specific prices. Everything is going to have the same price, the same amount of units. Do you want to buy them? What are we going to offer you over here? When you have drag along, you're saying, we're going to sell to another party over here, and you're going to come along with us at that same price and that same amount of
And they have
units.
to, yeah.
And you have to. Right?
And
You
you're
don't have
talking
any
about
other choice.
both of these in terms of if it's a corporation stock, right? When you're saying units
Or LLC.
or
Could be
LLC.
membership interest as well.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
exactly. Exactly.
All right.
So just like you'll hear things like calls, if you're going to buy stock at specific prices, a call is good. For instance, let's say that you're buying Apple stock, to give you an example, and you already have it at a specific price and it goes up, so you made
Mm-hmm.
money in that margin, and that's what you do for a call.
And so in our world, to dumb it down, because not smart like you, Deborah. So a call is basically
Yeah,
like,
no, smarter than-
I'm sorry. It's
you're
like you
smarter.
have
Go ahead.
no. If there's like four business partners and there's got to be
Yeah.
money that's going to be reinvested into the company because you want to grow. Hey, we're going to open up another office in up north, and every part. We're going to have to all come out of our own pocket because the company can't afford it. That's what a call is, right, Deborah? Is that each
Um,
owner is then putting money up.
yeah, that's not really per se that's really someone coming in with more capital. You're doing a capital call. So you're talking
Capital
about
call.
capital calls. I'm talking about calls, in the sense of buying and selling stock on the market. You're talking about capital calls over here, right, where they're saying to you, and that's why we're very careful. If I have something over here, I try to make sure there's no there's an anti-dilution clause. So, for instance, if you own 100 shares and it's worth X amount of money, if you do 1,000 shares now, it's still worth X amount of money. You still have X amount of control of the company. You're not going to lose that as they water it out to you. Okay, you're not
Gotcha.
going to water down or
Yep.
dilute your shares and your ownership rights. So you're very careful with that. So a lot of times when they do these capital calls and they say, well, if you don't put the capital in, then we can basically wipe out your membership.
Mm-hmm. And you have to be careful
Okay,
about
so you
that
want to
because
be careful.
and you want to be careful about those capital calls because if you're selling a portion of your business or you're doing a rollover and you end up in this situation and there ends up being a capital call, you don't want to be in a
Right.
situation where you sell your business and then you're retaining some ownership, but then they come back a year later and they're saying, okay, everybody's got to chip in, $50,000 for every share they own, and you own 10 shares, and you're like, I have to dump in $500,000, and you have to do it,
Right.
or you lose
Exactly.
your shares. So
Exactly.
that's the stuff you got to be protected about.
Exactly. You have to be protected totally with every one of these situations because if you don't know what they are and you wind up buying a business and selling a business, you're going to not know what you're getting into. And remember, when you start dealing with these companies, you're a minority owner. And that's what
Mm-hmm.
people do too. Remember, you're talking about one aspect of it, but a lot of times people are only selling part of the business. So then it's really important you have the right LLC operating agreement drawn up for you. They really have the right shareholders agreement drawn up for you. Otherwise, you could lose everything that you have.
We might, as business brokers, Deborah, as business brokers, and an end result, you might be seeing more of this, but the new laws that were passed
Right, right.
federally, where we are now allowed to sell a portion
Hmm.
of a business. And then on top of that,
Exactly.
SBA just came out
Hmm.
and they said that you can sell a portion of the business and get an SBA loan on that. So we might be
Right.
seeing more and more of these type of scenarios going on as we move forward. Because typically, Deborah, we over the years, I'm doing this nearly 25 years. I usually don't see that type of a situation, but now, with the law changes and the SBA new
Hmm.
rulings, it's something that's we might see it more often.
No, I agree with you. I think we are going to see it. I'm starting to see it more often now.
Are you
Where
really
people
already?
yeah, they want to buy a percentage of the business, and believe me, they want to buy 100% down the road, but they want the seller in there for 2, 3 years. And then they're going to basically buy out the seller. So you have a specified price, and that's fine. But in some of these, you don't have that, and you really have to be careful about your operating agreements with them or your shareholders agreements because otherwise, that seller is going to be left out in the cold. If they don't lawyer up properly, they're left out in
Oh,
the cold.
oh my gosh! In that kind of scenario, I'd make the buyer and the seller go talk to attorneys. There's so many things that could go wrong in a situation like
There,
that. I mean,
there
it's a
are.
good situation; it can be beneficial. I'm not trying to be negative on it,
Right.
but I'm just saying there's so many things that could come out of left field. You got to really think those things through.
No, no, you really do, and you really got to think through over here. This person's going to be now my partner. Okay, what
Mm.
do I want to see here? What do I want to do? What if I don't get along? What if I want to get out? Okay, what happens if they die? There's a lot of different scenarios you don't have when you sell a whole business to someone.
Mhm. What are some mistakes that you see brokers do with LOIs or contracts or advice you could give us to make us better?
Some of the mistakes I see in the LOIs is they're too short. Okay, if I know they're coming from even on a Main Street deal, I won't know what they want to do with the definitive agreement, and things haven't been discussed. And now they've been through the business, and now it's like, well, the buyer wants to buy, but nothing has been basically nailed down. So now it's
Right.
a free for all. Okay, or the buyer at this point in time says, hey, I've driven the business, I've looked at the business, now I want to change this, and this. Okay, so it's not been nailed down. And now it becomes a situation where the seller is going to wind up having an issue.
Yeah.
So it's not meant to be a long, long document, but it's meant to have all the essentials in there. If
Yeah.
you're going to do a promissory note, put the amount of the note, put how much is going to be there, put the right of offset there's going to be there, put everything down for the non-compete. Because you want to make sure you'll find out sometimes too, even though when you go through the LOI, you won't know that a child's involved in the business or a parent or a bunch of relatives, okay, who are in that business, and you want the non-compete signed by them
You know,
affiliated in businesses.
I agree with you. I agree with you, Deborah. Too short of an LOI is just not a good situation. Like you said before, or how I look at it. You didn't say this, but it's basically how I look at an LOI. It's basically an outline for the agreement down the road. And
Right,
you know,
right.
I don't want to be in a situation where we're negotiating major terms down the road because they weren't negotiated up front. You know, and those the
Yeah, and let
terms
me
should
let
be
me go through
filled
some of the
out.
terms never negotiated. Yep, a good point, Jim. And let's talk about WIP.
Work in
People don't
progress.
talk about formulas for WIP. People don't talk about warranties in LOIs. They don't talk about a lot of different issues that come back and bite someone. But my idea might be accounts receivable goes to me here as a seller. I might target accounts receivable as part of WIP in a different manner. Okay,
Hmm.
so I have to look at each business, and each business has its own rules, basically for how you would determine what's an accounts receivable, what's a payable, what am I doing over here for WIP, am I going and doing this business afterwards and taking, if I've gone ahead and made the sale, am I taking a portion of that money from a sale, what am I doing with the deposit, things like that need to be addressed. I
Yep.
might have 50 customer deposits, but I'm sitting here and I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but the seller thinks I had sales on those particular deals. Now I got to pay a commission to a salesperson, and I've spent the money marketing. Well, I want half, of that deposit before I
Yep.
release it to you. Okay, so but they're serious about it. So it just depends, so if you really look at that and you really say that's really how my industry runs, you need to write it out,
Yep. Put it on
because that's the
paper. Get
last thing
everybody
you
to
want to
agree
do is
on it up front.
right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. If you want to say that, and I have a really strange deal now where they're going to keep working the business after the business is sold, and they're going to work the business for up to a year. Okay. And what
Wow.
they've decided is I want these, if I've gone ahead and I've made these deals and the only thing left to do is ship them out, I want to be paid 100% of that deal. Well, if you wait until the very end to get that done, you never get that signed.
Right. Right.
You'd have a real problem at closing because you wouldn't get them to sign closing documents. They're like, no, 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 no. So all that has to be basically worked out ahead of time.
Anything else that you think that as brokers we might not do the best at, or we could improve upon, or you'd like to see
Well, let's say
happen?
earnout. Well,
Yeah, we haven't
let's
even
say
talked
that
about
I want a
earnouts.
more definitive. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
So if I have an earnout situation, I want to know exactly what are you looking to take off over here if it's not there. What are we looking to adjust? When are we looking to adjust it? And what the parameters are. Because if I don't know the parameters, I'll be handed a contract and it'll have one line. It'll say they're going to have an earnout of $50,000. I don't know what that means. So I just
Why?
have to sit there and go through it and say, what do you really want to do here? Because it's a big difference between how a buyer sees it and a seller sees it.
Oh gosh, and please
So
do the earnout based on revenue, not EBITDA or discretionary earnings, for goodness sakes, too, right?
right, right, and they'll do it on something like that, or they'll do it on something even worse. They'll do it on just accounts.
Mm.
So now I have an
Mm.
earnout, these amount of accounts left. What are they worth?
Right.
I'll
Right.
get, a broker will give me a contract and he'll say if 10 accounts leave, then basically, the earnout has to be XYZ. But it doesn't specify, you know, what accounts, how much they are, which 10 accounts. There's 150 accounts. They're not
Mm-hmm.
worth the same. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And that's for something, let's say that's general for a pool route, let's say. Something simple in that respect. How much is each account worth? What are you doing? If I'm doing an accountant, I'm doing a professional business and a certain amount of people leave, what do you expect then to be deducted? Do you want to give them the opportunity to replace them? Are they staying on with you for a period of time? So all these things have to be looked at before you just say do an earnout.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
So
Yep. Yeah.
be
You have
more
to spell out what they're now. That's funny. Doing a $50,000 earnout and it's just, that's it. Just period. That's funny. Yeah.
Yeah, and then other items that we want to be careful of too. Sometimes a business is run strictly by employees that you can't get anywhere else. So if you're in the middle of an area and you know all these employees have to stay with you, or you're not going to have a business, and you need to onboard them, sometimes that's something we're very careful of. And when are you going to onboard them? What are you going to do? A lot of these businesses, particularly M&A deals, they want to onboard and make sure they're onboarded first before they pay the money.
Yeah.
Okay, and they might say, I need 70% of these employees to stay on with me. We're going to onboard. We'll close maybe in escrow, or maybe we won't close. Maybe I won't onboard for another day or two, but I'm going to onboard before I let my money go to you to
Hmm.
make sure I have people there that aren't leaving. So it's a very delicate situation. Because remember, we hate when anybody talks to anyone before they close. We don't want them talking
Right.
to employees. We don't want to talk to anybody.
Right. Right.
Okay,
Right.
so you have a key employee you have to make them talk to. It could be an accounting person that's in there. It could be someone that runs the business for them on a regular basis. So you have to look at all the employees too in an LOI or in a definitive agreement. But you might want to discuss all this. Is there one key employee that key employee leaves, that business just went down the drain?
Yeah. Is there
So,
anything
you know,
else that you think there's a difference between Main Street and Upper Main Street? I mean, Main Street and M&A that, somebody from the Main Street world should know?
Well, those parts that we were talking about here are probably the biggest parts, and the biggest part is, like I said, an M&A deal, you want to make sure you have enough working capital. You want to make sure that you are onboarding their employees, and they're very, very, very careful. When I have a company that has maybe 5 or 6 other businesses or 10 other businesses, everything kind of rises and falls. I deal with one lender. That one lender might be giving me money for every single one of these deals. So you have that lender to look at as well, and you have to be very careful what you're doing. So if you've played games with employees, okay, and they're not 100% going to be on board with you, or you've paid them as 1099s and they should have been employees, these things are not going to fly when you do the M&A.
Yeah, they won't. No.
So when you see some of the Main Street businesses, we always kid about how many sets of books that they have, but you don't do that with these deals.
Right, right. Well, I don't do that with smaller deals either. But yeah, I agree.
No, 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 we don't knowingly do it. We just down the road. I mean, you take a simple, and people always they're really funny because they'll say a pizza deal is easier than an M&A deal. I think it's just the other way around.
Oh,
Whether it's
I wholeheartedly agree, Deborah. I look at it this way, and I know you were getting at because you're talking about the cash aspect, but I look at it this way from an M&A versus a Main Street deal. I don't want to say main M&A because I'm not an M&A guy, but a bigger deal versus a smaller deal
right,
is
right,
that I think you have to have more technical knowledge and
right,
capabilities as a business
right.
broker than selling a 2, 3, 4, $5 million business than a
Hmm.
$75,000 whatever. The technical knowledge needs to be a lot greater, and you have to. And on those size deals, you're also dealing in both worlds of Main Street and M&A. So you need to know when to apply what and what's appropriate and not. But I think for me, the big difference is that I think it's easier to do the bigger deals from a personality standpoint.
Right.
The person that owns that small business, sometimes they can be, they think they know everything, and they can be very difficult to work with. They don't know how the transaction process works, and they may not be listening to you and listen to other people, and it makes it really hard. On the flip side of that, the person that's
Right.
selling that $3, $4, $5 million business, they've gotten to where they've gotten because they've seeked out advice from professionals over the years, and they're used to getting
Exactly.
that advice. And they may not take all that advice, but they listen to it, they digest it, and they make a logical decision from there. And they are more business people as well. The buyers and sellers are more business type people, and their emotions aren't in it as much. I guess for the seller, the emotion's always there, but
Right. It's
um,
their baby, but still they're run like a business. And
yes,
some of the smaller mom and pops are run, in a day-to-day situation, not necessarily for the growth.
right. They're putting out fires all day.
Okay.
Yeah,
Putting out fires all day. Correct. Correct.
yeah.
So you'll see the difference in the businesses that get sold for that. And I'm finding that there are very few, which is nice. I've seen deal sizes increase tremendously in the state of Florida. Where
Really?
we used to look at $1 million, $2 million deal and say, that's a big deal. And now
Yeah.
they're commonplace, which is
Hmm.
good. Good. It
That is
shows you
good.
that people took the time, invested the time and the energy and worked with a team of people like you're talking about and made a good business that they can sell.
Yeah, and it's night and day. The systems and
Yeah.
processes that are involved in those type of businesses are much more entrenched. You got a better labor
Mhm.
force usually. The people are getting paid
Right.
better. The labor force. I mean, it's night and day in terms of just you take a $2 million business versus a $200,000 business. It's night and day, and that
Right.
$200,000 business isn't going to qualify for an SBA loan. You know what I mean?
Right.
So, it
Yeah.
might be an all cash offer. So you got a buyer coming along, putting 200 grand down to buy that $200,000 business. Well, guess what? They can take that $200,000 and they can buy a $2 million business. And that's down payment with an SBA loan. And so it's the
Right.
same amount of money out of pocket. But even after they pay off the loan every month, they're making a lot more money and they're buying
Yeah.
more of a business than a
Right.
job.
And I think one thing I forgot to talk about is leases.
Mm,
Okay.
good thing to touch
So,
on.
and it's interesting because as you work on a bigger deal, you'll realize that many times the sellers are very, very they know their landlords very well. They've been in business a long period of time, and you want to be very careful for confidentiality to maybe do that lease at the very, very end. You don't have an SBA hanging over you where you got to have the landlord waiver. You have an M&A deal, and that might be the last piece you do because the minute you tell that landlord tells everybody else.
Yeah, unfortunately.
And all of a sudden now all the employees know your business is for sale, and that's the last thing you wanted to do. So it's just important pieces to this as you start looking at the whole puzzle. It's a very different way. Where if we had a regular Main Street deal, we might say, okay, after due diligence, let them talk to the landlord.
Hmm. Yeah.
Okay, but here it might be that we're not letting them talk to the landlord to the very, very end. Because
Yeah.
typically in these larger deals, their landlord isn't even super important, but you need to have the business run somewhere.
Right. And typical I don't know, the bigger deals that I've done, at least we're not dealing with retail type space usually, so
Right,
it's not as critical as like a pizza shop that's in a public strip mall
right,
that,
right.
without that lease you're doomed, you know.
But sometimes in these businesses, even though they're not retail, I just did a company. Let's say you're doing a moving company or a company that has storage or something. I need that warehouse
Or they have
because I
extra,
can't get
like I've
everything out of there.
you're right, and I've sold businesces where that
Yeah,
location has the electricity and the water that's coming into the
right,
buildings has greatly increased. They spend a lot of money to fix those building ups to get them into shape to handle the work that they're doing. So it does
right,
become
right.
critical because they could have. I mean, one business
So
I did,
that's
they had like
important.
they spent, I forget. I was going to say 300 grand, but I think they spent more closer to $500,000 to increase their electrical and their water capacity in there as a manufacturing type business.
Right, right. And I've seen some businesses, if you're doing, let's say, a high tech business, you're gonna increase everything over here. If there's a hurricane, they don't want that business going down.
Right.
So they're putting
Yeah.
money in expensive generators into all kinds of things over here. So you got to be very careful with the lease.
Well, Deborah, I
So
don't want to keep you.
landlords even, yeah,
Go ahead.
go ahead, Joe. I'm
Landlords?
sorry.
No,
No, I
go
was
ahead,
going to say
landlord.
landlords even in the very end, and all of our deals still wind up being pretty important.
Yeah. Deborah, I don't want to keep you too long. Do you remember how you and I met?
I certainly do. That was a very fun transaction.
Yeah. Well, actually, the first time I heard of you, it was somebody that was a different nationality, and they called you Deborah. So for
Yes.
2 years, I
Mhm.
thought your name was Deborah.
Oh, sure. Yeah,
but
I answered to everything, including, unfortunately, to dinner. That was
And so I'm up in Orlando, and Deborah's down in South Florida. That tells you how, and I use her all the time. So it tells you how much I think about Deborah, that she's that far away, and I
pretty
use her all the
brilliant. Yeah.
time. But I was sitting in a state board meeting, Business Brokers of Florida state board meeting, and somebody brought up Carman, and I said, "Oh, you're talking about Deborah?" And they said, Deborah. And I go, yeah, Deborah Carman. And they all started laughing. I was like, oh, because they were all from South Florida. But
Right.
but a couple years later, you and I met officially. And you mind me sharing that story?
No, not at all,
Th-
Jim.
this is fantastic. So we co-broke in the state of Florida, for you brokers that are outside the state of Florida. And I was doing a deal with another broker, a really, really, really good broker that I've got a lot of respect for, tons of knowledge. He had the listing, and I was working with the buyer. Well, these two attorneys, I'm not going to get into the specifics, but the two attorneys, the buyer's attorney and the seller's attorney, they were butting heads, and they could not get anything done, could not agree on anything. And our deal was falling apart. And for like 3 weeks, it was at a complete standstill. I mean, I'm talking like 3 weeks where the attorneys stopped talking to each other, and nothing was moving. They couldn't even agree on one word. So the other broker and I hired Deborah out of her own pocket to step into the transaction and negotiate between the two attorneys the agreement. And Deborah,
Hmm.
you were just amazing. You were incredible. I don't think we could have gotten that deal done without you.
Thank you,
And
Jim.
since that time, Deborah, you've done a lot of my transactions as a closing attorney, and when I'm dealing with LOIs and things like that with my sellers or buyers, they just need advice when it comes to a deal transaction. I give them to you, and you're always fantastic. You think outside the box, and I think that is what separates elite professionals from a good or a great professional. Whether you're a business
Well,
broker or you're an attorney, being able to think outside that box and get deals done, and you're amazing, Deborah. You really are, and you also know
thanks,
when to
Jim. And that's
cut.
why we work so well together because you think out of the box too, and you really have to be hands on. And Jim's hands on, and I don't say that. I do work with a lot of brokers, and I know when I have a problem because some of the brokers are MIA. Yeah, they're gone. They're MIA.
I'm not
I'll
around.
see him at the very end over there, and I'm like, okay, because you really have to be a team, and that's one of the things that we talk about. If you don't become a team, then you're really not doing your client a service either,
You're
because
absolutely right.
you're really not.
I feel like I've built part of why I'm where I'm at is because I've built a team of professionals like Deborah, like my SBA lenders. I'm not talking about my internal team, which I'm really I'm so happy about my
Yeah, you have a
internal team.
great team.
They're
Yeah, you do.
fantastic. But I'm talking
I
about
love
that
your team.
that. Thank you. The outside team that comes in, and we look at them as team. And actually, Stephanie, my closing coordinator, she always, when she emails you guys, she actually puts team. And I've never asked her to
Right.
do that. She
No,
just
it's
goes
a hundred
team,
percent.
comma, and she emails you
Yeah,
guys.
and she's absolutely right because without a team, you don't take care of your client properly. And for all the business brokers out over there, get a team. Okay,
Yeah.
without that team, and I always tell, I
A
teach
great
a
team.
lot of times, and without a good solid team behind you, then you wind up with a problem because it doesn't mean that every deal I even take, it just means you have a resource. And
Yeah.
I encourage all the brokers out of there to find an attorney they can work with that'll be a resource for them and they can run things, and pass them by and get some ideas. There was even a crazy one I had yesterday where the broker calls me up and he says, "Well, we want to be able to give more money to the real estate, but we need to close the business first." I said, "Well, the only way you can do that is you can't close either one of them together now. You can do maybe a management agreement and then later on close them both together. But you can't close one and then say, well, that counts towards your real estate deal. It doesn't work won't work that
Right.
way. But if we sit there and we all think about it together, we can come up with a solution. And that's why, that's why you do as well as you do. And a lot of people need that understanding that you need to be able to sit down. And I always call it chewing. And it's interesting because in this day and age, I see young attorneys and I see what goes on over here. Nobody wants to think because everybody wants action. Okay,
Yep.
Jim, you're younger than I am, but I think you can remember a time there was an email. There
Yeah. Oh
wasn't that
yeah.
constant, let's go, let's go, let's go, let's go, let's go. So I'll tell people and they'll laugh at me. I'm like, let me chew on this for a minute. Let me think about a solution because you have to be able to sit down and find something that's going to be creative enough that everybody works. Because
Well,
what do we
you
all
got
want to do? We want to get to the finish line.
absolutely. You got a seller that really wants to sell their business. You got a buyer that
Right.
really wants to buy the business. They get along, and there's an obstacle, and how I approach things, and Deborah, I think you're the same way. I think too many times is approached as an adversarial type of a situation: seller versus buyer, buyer versus seller, broker versus the other broker, attorney versus
Buyer's
attorney.
attorney versus seller's attorney. I get that all
Yeah,
the time. Yeah,
yeah, and
yeah.
no, we're here. We're trying to get a transaction done. The seller wants to sell. The buyer wants to buy. What are the
Right.
seller's concerns? What are the buyer's concerns? What are their motivations? What can we do so that maybe we're not going to get everybody 100%, but hey, if we can get everybody 95%, phenomenal. That's what we're looking for. And you know
Perfect.
what? It's the best interest. Look, if the seller, we're not selling used cars where the person's driving off
Right.
the lot, you sign the contract, paying the money, the person's off the lot. My deals take 90 days to close. From the time of contract to closing, we're looking at a 90-day process, my deals. And
Mm-hmm.
except for the one that's closing today for us, Deborah. That's
Right.
but there's so many things that we need to get through as a
Yeah.
team that if
Yeah.
one party at the time of signing that contract feels slighted, we're not going to get to the closing table. Everybody needs to feel good when that LOI or that APA is signed up front so that we can get to that transaction at the end of the day. And you can't sit there and you can't beat people up. And for the seller, they need to be in a position where if they're good people, if the seller is a good person, and that's who my buyers and my sellers are good people, because I won't list a
Mm-hmm.
business if my seller's not a good
Right.
person. But they care about their employees. They want their employees to be taken care of. They want their customers to be taken care of. They want their vendors. A good business owner wants their vendors to even be taken care of.
Right.
And they want to see their name because it's their baby. They'd love to see that name move on and go on. And so why beat up the buyer? And for the buyer, why beat up the seller? Because you know what? You're going to need that seller post close. And even if you don't think so, you never know what might happen. Something weird comes out of left
Yeah.
field, and you can call up the seller and say, "Hey, did this ever happen to you?" And the seller might be like, "Oh, something similar to that happened to me like 5 years ago, and this is how we handled it." And da 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 da. That buyer being able to do it, and it's for brokers. I think sometimes, and I know I'm going on a tangent here, but I think sometimes brokers look at it as they're trying to get one over on the other broker. And to me, that's not the
Right.
spirit of co-brokering. The spirit of co-brokering is you're a professional, I'm a professional. We know what lanes we're working in, and we're trying to get something done for the seller and the buyer that's going to result in something good for them. And it's not about our egos on beating each other up. It's about working together.
No,
So
that's a good point, Jim, and I see that with you all the time, and that is so important. And I see attorneys do that all the time too, where they're at each other's throats. And what I always look to do is just say, okay, fine, the attorney is having either a bad day or a bad whatever. Let's get this beyond this, and let's get this deal closed, and let's get this taken care of. And you really have to let personalities go by because everyone has a different personality. Attorney,
yeah.
accountants, brokers, we're all here to work together to do one thing, which is to get the deal closed. And people lose sight of that all the time. And I know you do, and I know you want to get the deal closed for the people. It's the right thing to do, and we'll find a way to do it, and that's the best way. But
You
I
know,
do see a lot of adversarial.
there is, and it's unfortunate.
And
And I
one
know
thing I
we have
wanted
to.
to say, Jim,
Yeah, good. I'm sorry.
sorry,
Go ahead.
one thing I just wanted to add to that is um, I work in a certain way. So if I can't I represent a seller and I want to be able to talk to the buyer, I might talk to you about that. And you'll
Hmm.
figure out a way to get the party straightened out. And then always make the attorneys the bad guys because we don't care. At the end of the
Right.
day, if it's a tough, tough decision, I want my client left alone. I don't want my seller to have a fight with the buyer and vice versa. I want it to be if the attorneys are going to fight about it, they'll fight about it. But keep that
Yeah.
away. Let them all be copacetic. And you basically behind the scenes work wonders. So half of what I need is taken care of, and all I have to do is just figure out legally how to put it in writing.
No, no,
And that's the
thank you,
best
Deborah.
way.
It is. It is. And you got to keep those relationships between the buyer and the seller intact and positive. And one thing that, and I think that for those brokers out there, I've been doing this for about 2 years now, and it's game changing if you're not doing
Hmm.
this. And again, I'm not working in the M&A world, so you M&A, if there's anybody listens to M&A, you might be like, hey, I'm in the Upper Main Street area, but the thought process that business brokers are taught that you go under contract, you want to keep the buyer and the seller apart from each other until you get to the closing table. And I think that's such the wrong mentality, because usually the buyer puts the offer in because they like the business, but they're also like, I like the seller. And the seller, a lot, it's important to them that they like the buyer because that's who's taken over their baby. And so what we
Right.
do at our office, we started about 2 years ago on my transaction, and it's been great, is every 2 weeks, once we get under contract, every 2 weeks, myself, my closing coordinator, Stephanie, the buyer, the seller, and if there's another broker involved, the broker gets on the call. And we get on the call and we talk, and we have the seller talk about any updates that's going on in the business. They hired somebody, they fired somebody, they picked up a project, they
Hmm.
lost a project, whatever it is, any updates. Let the buyer give updates on what's going on their end with whether their attorney's putting together the contract, or what's going on with the financing. And obviously the parties know pretty much everything anyways, because we're communicating that, but hearing it from each other goes a long way. And then we open it up for Q&A with each other. And then we do that every 2 weeks and it might be been about an hour. And then you get to a certain point in the transaction and everything's just with the bank. The call might only be 10 minutes. And then when you get towards the end, the last 2 or 3 weeks, we might move it into an every week situation, because we're talking about how that transition is going to take over after closing. And
Right.
what it's done is it brings the buyer and the seller closer together. And they
Hmm.
all feel really comfortable and confident because of the communication that everybody's talking about. The brokers, the buyer, and the seller, we're all hearing it from each other at the same time, talking about it. And if everybody feels better about the transaction. And you know what, Deborah? When there is a problem, because things pop up once you go under
They do.
contract. When there is a
They do.
problem, that buyer and the seller are more likely to work it out. They're more willing to work it out because they've been communicating. Instead of them loving
Yeah.
each other, going under contract, and then keeping them away from each other for 90 days, have
Right.
structured calls. I wouldn't have the buyer and the seller call without, just have the buyer call the seller anytime they want, but have them structured calls, so.
No, absolutely agree with you. And I was just going to add one thing that separates you from the rest of the pack, is that after closing, and I've watched you do it, if there's a question or there's a concern, you will pick up the phone and contact the buyer and the seller. And that is so important because these deals that wind up in litigation, it's all communication driven.
Yeah.
If you would have communication between the buyer and seller even after the deal closes, then you're not going to normally have that same breakdown in
Yeah.
communication. So all the way throughout the deal, you have the communication. Even when the deal is closed, keep the communication there, and that keeps things copacetic.
I think it's so important too. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And usually the disputes start out just a little small, and if you can quelch them right off the bat, you're in
Hmm.
great shape.
Yeah.
Well, Deborah, I want to let you go. I'm taking too much of your time today. I really appreciate you sitting with us today and chatting. Thank you.
Likewise, thank you, Jim. Appreciate it very much.
Well, thank you. And for you business brokers out there listening, if you are liking the content that you're hearing, please do me a favor, like the video, comment on the video, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you can make sure that you can hear more videos down the road. Well, thanks a lot for joining us today. Take care.